They ruled with cruelty, sending thousands to their deaths, but in the end, justice came for them. From hangings that went horribly wrong to last-minute confessions, these are the gruesome executions of Nazi camp commanders that you won't forget. Dachau, the blueprint for Nazi concentration camps. When Dachau first opened in 1933, it wasn't yet the full-scale death machine that later camps like Auschwitz would become. It was initially a forced labor detention center, designed to hold those the Nazis considered political threats. Heinrich Himmler, one of Hitler's most ruthless lieutenants, called it the first concentration camp for political prisoners. It began with trade unionists, communists, and democratic socialists, but as the Nazi regime grew, its list of victims expanded. Soon, Dachau was filled with Jews, Roma, Gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals, anyone the Nazis deemed undesirable. But Dachau didn't just hold prisoners. It trained those who would oversee some of the worst atrocities in history. Theodor Eicke, an SS officer, turned Dachau into a model of terror. He created a brutal system of discipline based on fear, violence, and absolute dehumanization. Prisoners were forced into slave labor, subjected to severe beatings, starved as punishment, and executed without warning for attempting to escape. The suffering didn't stop there. Medical experiments were carried out on prisoners, including injections of malaria and tuberculosis, as well as high-altitude and hypothermia tests that left many dead. Those who perished from overwork, torture, or disease were sent straight to the on-site crematorium, where their bodies were burned en masse. Etched into the iron gate that separated the camp from the rest of the world was a chilling message: Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. But for thousands of prisoners, the only freedom Dachau offered was death. Dachau's horrifying success became the template for all other Nazi concentration camps. The brutality perfected here would later be repeated at Auschwitz, Treblinka, and beyond. And as the Nazis continued their reign of terror, Eicke himself was promoted to Inspector General of all German concentration camps, spreading his doctrine of cruelty even further. By 1945, as Allied forces closed in, the Nazi commanders tried to cover their tracks. Mass killings increased, and attempts were made to erase evidence of the atrocities. But it was too late. The world would soon discover the horrors of Dachau, and those responsible would have to answer for their crimes. What happened to the monsters who ran Dachau? The answer is shocking, and in some cases, just as brutal as the horrors they inflicted. Their day of reckoning was coming, and it wouldn't be pretty. First the smell, then the death train, the horror that greeted U.S. soldiers at Dachau. By April 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. The Allies were pushing deep into Nazi territory, liberating towns, villages, and cities that had suffered under Hitler's rule. But nothing could have prepared the American soldiers for what awaited them at Dachau, one of the most notorious concentration camps in Germany. The first warning came not from what they saw, but from what they smelled. As U.S. infantrymen from the 45th Infantry Division approached, a thick, nauseating stench filled the air. Some soldiers thought they were near a chemical factory, while others compared it to the sickly, burning odor of feathers being singed off a plucked chicken. The smell was so overpowering that it stuck to their clothes and seemed impossible to escape. But this was no factory. What they were smelling was the stench of death. When they arrived at the camp's gates, they came face to face with one of the most haunting sights of the war: the death train. Weeks before the Americans reached Dachau, Nazi officials had been in a panic. They knew Allied forces were closing in, and they scrambled to cover up their crimes. One of their desperate actions was the forced evacuation of Buchenwald, another brutal concentration camp located in central Germany. In early April 1945, at least 3,000 prisoners were packed into 40 train cars and sent to Dachau. The plan was to move these prisoners before Buchenwald fell into Allied hands. But what followed was a journey so horrific that it became one of the darkest moments of the war. The prisoners inside the train were already weak and starving, having endured months or even years of mistreatment at Buchenwald. Now, they were forced into tightly packed boxcars with little room to sit or breathe. They had no food. They had no water. The windows were sealed, trapping the heat inside and turning the train cars into suffocating ovens. What was supposed to be a short journey turned into a 3-week-long nightmare. The train's movement was chaotic and unplanned, frequently stopping and rerouting due to destroyed tracks and advancing Allied troops. Inside the cars, men collapsed from exhaustion. Disease spread rapidly. Some prisoners went mad from hunger and thirst, while others simply gave up and died where they stood. Their bodies remained wedged between the living, rotting under the relentless spring sun. By the time the train finally reached Dachau, only a quarter of the passengers were still alive. The rest, thousands of men, had perished in one of the most horrific death marches of the war. The Nazi guards didn't even bother to remove the bodies. They simply left them inside the train cars to rot. When the American soldiers arrived, this was the first thing they saw. For the battle-hardened men of the 45th Infantry Division, nothing in combat had prepared them for what they found at Dachau. The moment they stepped onto the railway tracks, they saw the rail cars lined up before them, filled with corpses. The sight was so overwhelming that many stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the horror before them. The dead were piled on top of each other, their bodies twisted and contorted from their agonizing deaths. Some had their mouths frozen open, as if gasping for air in their final moments. Their skeletal frames showed the unmistakable signs of starvation. The smell of decomposition was so thick that some soldiers vomited on the spot. But as horrifying as the death train was, what lay inside the concentration camp itself was even worse. The gates of hell, just beyond the train track, stood the massive iron gate of Dachau, bearing the infamous Nazi slogan, Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. This cruel phrase had greeted every prisoner who entered, promising freedom through labor. But for most who came here, there was no escape. Inside the camp, the American soldiers found tens of thousands of prisoners barely clinging to life. Their bodies were skin and bones, their eyes sunken, their faces covered in sores. Many were too weak to even lift their heads when the soldiers arrived. Others, realizing that they were finally free, collapsed in tears. As the soldiers moved deeper into the camp, they discovered barracks filled with dying men, torture rooms, and execution sites. The most shocking discovery was the crematorium, a massive furnace where countless bodies had been burned to hide the evidence of Nazi atrocities. Dachau had been a factory of death, and the Americans had arrived just in time to witness its final moments. For the men who liberated Dachau, the images of the death train, the starving prisoners, and the crematoriums would haunt them forever. Many of them later described it as the most disturbing experience of their lives. Some soldiers, overcome with rage, turned their guns on the remaining SS guards. Others forced local German civilians to walk through the camp and witness what had happened there, ensuring that no one could ever deny the atrocities that had taken place. Dachau was the first concentration camp built by the Nazis, and in many ways it served as the blueprint for all the others. What the US soldiers uncovered there was just a small glimpse of the full horror of the Holocaust. The death train was only the beginning. Bodies stacked like cordwood, the unseen horror. Inside Dachau. When American soldiers finally stepped into Dachau, nothing could have prepared them for the scene that unfolded before their eyes. The camp, once a place of forced labor and unspeakable cruelty, had become a final resting ground for thousands of victims. The horrors they witnessed inside were even more shocking than the grim sight of the death train they had encountered just outside the gates. In the final days before liberation, Nazi officials desperately moved prisoners from various camps across Germany to Dachau, even sending some from Auschwitz. These new arrivals, already weakened by starvation and disease, were forced into overcrowded barracks. Buildings meant for a few hundred inmates now held up to 1,600 people at a time. The cruel conditions, insufficient food, contaminated water, and rampant diseases like typhus led to a rapid decline in the health of the prisoners. Many could barely stand or speak, their bodies worn down by months of neglect and abuse. As the soldiers moved further into the camp, they were struck by a sight that would haunt them forever. Piles of dead bodies lay scattered throughout the area, arranged in a manner that resembled stacks of cordwood. The naked, emaciated corpses, with skin stretched tight over frail frames, painted a stark picture of the mass death that had taken place in Dachau. The orderly cruelty of the Nazi system was laid bare in these grim formations, each body a silent testament to the endless suffering inflicted upon innocent lives. The smell of decay and burning flesh filled the air, a constant, nauseating reminder of the life that had been snuffed out within these walls. The stench was overpowering, penetrating the soldiers' clothes and lingering long after they had left the camp. For many, the overwhelming odor combined with the visual horror of the stacked bodies was too much to bear. It was a brutal encounter with the reality of systematic extermination, an experience that defied all previous images of war and destruction. In the chaos of those final days, the Nazis had attempted to erase their crimes by burning as many bodies as possible, yet the sheer number of victims made it impossible to hide the truth. Some prisoners were forced on grueling death marches, where those who slowed down were shot or left behind to perish. Even as Dachau's liberation was imminent, the camp remained a scene of relentless suffering, a place where hope had been all but extinguished. For the American soldiers, the vision of bodies stacked like cordwood was more than just a memory. It was a stark symbol of human cruelty and the devastating cost of unchecked power. The images of Dachau, marked by starvation, disease, and the cold, clinical disposal of human life, would remain with them long after the war ended, serving as a somber reminder of the depths of inhumanity that must never be repeated. In a fit of rage, soldiers gun down Nazi prisoners. When the American soldiers of the 45th Thunderbird Division first came upon the death train, it sparked a fury they had never known. These men had fought for over 500 days in brutal combat, facing horrors on every battlefield. Yet nothing could have prepared them for the train filled with innocent bodies. The sight of lifeless eyes and open mouths, as if silently pleading for mercy, broke many of them. Some of the soldiers fell to their knees, overcome with tears and grief, while others burned with anger at the evil they had witnessed. As the soldiers gathered near the train, 4 German officers suddenly appeared from the nearby woods, holding up a white handkerchief. This small gesture, perhaps meant to signal surrender, only inflamed the already volatile mood of the American troops. Lieutenant William Walsh, a leader among the men, immediately ordered the officers into one of the boxcars where the corpses lay scattered. Without hesitation, he fired his pistol, striking one of the officers down. As the wounded men cried out in pain, other soldiers quickly joined in, finishing the grim task with cold determination. Inside Dachau itself, the terror continued to unfold. The camp was already a place of endless suffering, but here, the American soldiers found themselves in a chaotic and angry environment. In a coal yard at the heart of the camp, an estimated 50 to 125 SS officers and other German military personnel, including some who worked in the camp's hospital, were gathered. The soldiers, still reeling from what they had just seen at the death train, were filled with a mix of sorrow and seething rage. Lieutenant Walsh did not wait long. He called for a machine gun, rifles, and a Tommy gunner to join him. As his men loaded the belt of bullets into the machine gun, the German prisoners began to rise and move toward the American soldiers. In that heated moment, Walsh reportedly pulled out his pistol again and shouted, "Let them have it!" Within 30 seconds, a storm of gunfire erupted. When the smoke finally cleared, at least 17 of the German prisoners lay dead in the coal yard, victims of the overwhelming anger that had taken control. This act of violence was not common among American soldiers during the liberation of camps. Historians like John McManus have noted that such brutal reactions were rare and often stemmed from the leadership present at the scene. In this instance, the intense emotional pressure and the overwhelming sights of death had driven the soldiers to a breaking point. Their leader's loss of control spread among the ranks, leading to a tragic and violent outburst. In that moment, the faces of those who had long suffered under Nazi cruelty were echoed in the rage of the liberators. The line between justice and revenge blurred, as soldiers, scarred by the atrocities they had witnessed, took a grim form of action against their former captors. The memory of that day would haunt them for years to come, a stark reminder of how even those fighting for freedom can be overwhelmed by the horrors of war. Unequipped to help the survivors, When the American soldiers reached Dachau, one of the most shocking sights was the sight of nearly 32,000 surviving prisoners. These people were barely alive, reduced to walking skeletons by extreme malnutrition and illness. Many of them suffered from typhus and were infested with lice. As the soldiers moved through the camp, these fragile survivors reached out to their liberators, clutching at uniforms in disbelief, hardly able to understand that their long nightmare was finally over. The soldiers, though hardened by battle, were not ready to deal with the deep wounds of starvation and disease. They had been trained to fight and win wars, not to nurse people back to health. In a desperate attempt to help, they opened up their rations and handed out Hershey bars and other food. The intent was to feed these starving souls and give them hope. However, the bodies of the prisoners were so weak that they could not handle solid food. Instead of providing healing, the sudden intake of food made many of them very sick. Decades later, some soldiers admitted that they felt deep remorse. They recalled the mix of horror and pity, the revulsion at the sight of the emaciated figures and the guilt that came with overfeeding them. Many felt as though they were harming the survivors by trying to help, even as they did their best to bring comfort. The tragedy did not end with the immediate crisis of starvation. The American soldiers quickly realized that they could not simply let the survivors leave the camp. These people were in no condition to survive on their own. They needed careful medical attention, proper food, and a safe place to heal. This meant that the survivors had to remain in Dachau or be moved to other facilities until they could recover, a process that would take many months. Meanwhile, many of the Jewish prisoners who had lived through endless terror were forced to live in displaced persons camps for years. These camps, though a step toward freedom, were only temporary homes. The survivors had to face a long wait before they could find new lives in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, or in what would later become Israel. The American liberators, trained for battle but not for healing, were left with memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed firsthand the suffering of men, women, and children who had endured more than anyone could imagine. The efforts to help, though filled with compassion, were fraught with heartache and unintended harm. In the aftermath of liberation, the task of rebuilding shattered lives and healing deep wounds fell on many shoulders, a challenge that went far beyond the battlefields of war. From liberators to witnesses, most of the American soldiers who helped free Dachau did not stay long after the camp was liberated. Their main task was to move quickly onto other missions, leaving the care of the survivors to specialized combat medical units. Meanwhile, engineering teams were busy burying the bodies and cleaning up the camp. Despite their limited time there, the liberators left with memories that would change their lives forever. Word of what had happened at Dachau and other camps like Buchenwald spread fast through the Allied ranks. In the days and weeks following liberation, many soldiers and officers returned to the camps to see the horrors for themselves. They needed to witness firsthand the crimes that had been committed by the Nazis. For these men, the war was no longer just about defeating an enemy on the battlefield. It was about fighting an unimaginable evil that had brought death and suffering to thousands of innocent people. Even as the news of Adolf Hitler's suicide broke out the day after Dachau was liberated, and German defeat was almost certain, the true meaning of the war took on a deeper, more personal tone for many of the soldiers. High-ranking military leaders felt it was important to see the camp with their own eyes. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, along with Generals George Patton and Omar Bradley, made a point to visit a nearby concentration camp called Ohrdruf on April 12, 1945, just a week after it had been freed. Their visit was not merely a formality, it was a deliberate effort to document the truth of what had taken place. Eisenhower understood that one day, some might try to dismiss the stories of these atrocities as mere propaganda. He wanted to have clear, first-hand evidence of the horrors that had unfolded, so that history would remember exactly what had occurred. "The things I saw beggar description," Eisenhower later said. His words captured the shock and deep sorrow he felt after witnessing the overwhelming signs of starvation, cruelty, and inhumanity. The visual evidence, along with the testimonies from survivors, left him so disturbed that he felt compelled to record his own observations. These leaders believed that it was their duty to ensure that the truth of the Holocaust would not be denied in the future. In that short time at Dachau, the American liberators became more than just soldiers. They turned into witnesses of history. Their experiences were a powerful reminder of the cost of hate and the depths of human cruelty. The memories of those bleak days in the camps continued to haunt them long after the war ended, serving as an everlasting testament to the need for justice and remembrance. Through their brave acts of witnessing, they ensured that the world would never forget the true scale of Nazi atrocities. The horrors of Dachau left an unforgettable mark on those who witnessed it, reminding us why history must never be forgotten. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful history content.